resuming our discussion from the last segment, we talked about after World War I, this line representing the percent politically participant, which in a pre-mass politics is pretty low, 10, 15%, going down toward mass politics, something around 80%. With the tide of public opinion rising in Egypt, British realized that they are now compelled to rule indirectly because it's simply too costly to try to rule directly. And they know they have to bring in an Egyptian instead of a minority that, such as Nobar Pasha, that if you recall from previous lectures, Cromer had brought in. Also, there was a time that 1,000 British troops were able to control all of Egypt. After World War I, not only 1,000 troops were not enough, they now needed 20,000 troops, and it was not even clear to them who was the enemy for these troops. So out of this situation, what we get is a creation around 1918 of the first great party in all of Middle East, not just Egypt, and that's the WAFT political party at the end of World War I. That party is very much like Iran's National Front, or if you like, by comparison, similar to what Congress Party was in India, or even early on in the case of Mexico, PRI. It is a democratic dominant party of Egypt, and Zaghloul is part of that coalition of WAFT, and Zaghloul becomes very, very popular in all of Egypt. Remember, he's a very charismatic leader as well. It is a party that could get 90% of the votes in a free election. How do I know that? Well, we'll see later on. Now, after World War I, there's something else happening at the international arena, and that is President Woodrow Wilson pushes his 14 points. One of these points was this whole concept of national self-determination. In other words, it's a polite term for saying the colonialists should pack up and go and allow the countries that they dominated to achieve independence. Zaghloul listened to that doctrine, and he thought it also applies to Egypt. And so that becomes, in a sense, Woodrow Wilson's idea of national self-determination becomes the animus for Zaghloul to form this delegation called WAFT. Actually, WAFT means delegation, to go to Paris at the end of World War I to present Egypt's case for independence from the British. As you could guess, the French did not allow them to attend the conference, but the very act of organizing it and the very act of making this such a public spectacle really worked to the advantage of the Egyptian and to the detriment of the British. Now remember, British are now trying to rule indirectly, but they're being challenged by Zaghloul and their party WAFT and other Democrats that have joined up with Zaghloul. So in response to this audacious move by Zaghloul and the WAFT to go to Paris to make their case, to plead their case, they respond by sending Zaghloul to exile in Malta. Their move, however, backfires. Again, there's a lot of rioting, uprising, and from that uprising comes what can be called Egypt's first revolution. So in 1919, Egypt's first revolution is reflection of the reaction to sending Zaghloul to exile. Egyptians and Sudanese masses begin to riot, and this revolution really began to change the image that British had of the Egyptian. Up to that point, Westerners and British saw Egyptians as very nice people. If you recall, I mentioned they were really, in a sense, they really liked the Egyptians, but not the Iranians, for example, because Iranians were seen as too obstreperous. But Egyptians were liked because they were regarded as being very docile and happy, despite all the hardship they had to experience. But now, all of a sudden, the Egyptians are betraying their image among the Westerners. They are behaving very unpleasantly, and from the British perspective, very un-Egyptian. So as a result of this challenge in their, or I should say, as a result of this change, this sudden change in Egyptians' character, British are forced to bring Zaghloul back once again. So they bring him back from exile, and this became known. The return of Zaghloul after these protests and riot becomes known as Egypt's first revolution. In 1922, the British did something else. Realizing that they can't work things out with Zaghloul, they decide that unilaterally they will declare Egypt to be independent. So what they did symbolically was to lower their flag, but the British troops were still there, and the Egyptians simply did not buy any of the symbolism. They knew that they were still regarded by British as their colony. Next, the British, desperate how to deal with this, they allowed WAFT, that great party that I mentioned, to have a free election in 1924. So notice those who think there were never democracy in Middle East. We already talked about Iran. Now we can look at Egypt. Actually, there was democracy in Egypt circa 1924. And guess what? WAFT party gets 90% of the votes, 190 of the 214 seats in the Chamber of Deputies. So we have democracy in Egypt. With 90% of the votes, Zaghloul becomes Egypt's first constitutional prime minister. And remember, this happened, the equivalent of this would be 1952 in Iran. This happened several decades earlier in the case of Egypt. All right, so with Zaghloul becoming the first constitutional prime minister of Egypt, British thought, now that he has become the elected prime minister, he will now begin to act as a moderate responsible. Instead, Zaghloul's first demand is for the British to leave. This really angers the British, and they bring in more troops. They bring in more troops, and they do one more thing. They said the earlier election, which was democratic, was null and void. Instead, they rig a new election and declare that this is the right election. They, quote, elect a party called, look at the chutzpah for the name of the party. The party is called National Liberal Party. So they created this National Liberal Party, and now Egyptians are being ruled by the Turkish-speaking landowners once again. So it's a throwback to the Mamluks almost. But then again, there is strong reaction. The masses riot. They don't buy it. Once again, the British bring back Zaghloul. And once again, Zaghloul refuses to be a moderate responsible, which the British had hoped he would be. But by now, Zaghloul is getting old, and in 1927, he passes away. The British were really, truly puzzled. They kept wondering what got into Zaghloul. Remember, their assumption was this: what these people really want is personal power. They don't care about their nations. They don't care about independence. They're just selfish people that want power. And so if you give them power, then they should act very friendly toward those who were giving him the power. So all along, the British keeps assuming that if they give him power, he would be a nice, predictable, moderate, responsible. And yet, they didn't learn. Each time they betrayed him, they keep being puzzled why he's not behaving the way their theory would indicate he should behave. It was difficult for them to understand that identifying with your own nation, having a sense of national dignity, is not a monopoly of the British, but other people in other countries have the same feeling.